Little Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time there lived a little country girl, the prettiest creature who was ever seen. Her mother had a little red riding hood made for her. Everybody called her Little Red Riding Hood. One day her mother said to her, "Go, my dear, and see how your grandmother is doing, for I hear she has been very ill." Little Red Riding Hood set out immediately. As she was going through the wood, she met with a wolf. He asked her where she was going. "I'm going to see my grandmother." "Does she live far off?" said the wolf. "It is beyond that mill you see there." It was not long before the wolf arrived at the old woman's house. He knocked at the door. Tap, tap, tap.
"Who's there?" "Your grandchild, Little Red Riding Hood,"
replied the wolf, faking her voice. The good grandmother cried out,
"Pull the string and the latch will go up."
The wolf pulled the string in, and the door opened, and then he immediately fell upon the good woman and ate her up in a moment. He then shut the door and got into the grandmother's bed, expecting Little Red Riding Hood, who came some time afterwards and knocked at the door. Tap, tap, tap.
"Who's there?"
said the wolf. "It is your grandchild, Little Red Riding Hood." The wolf cried out to her,
"Pull the string and the latch will go up."
Little Red Riding Hood pulled the string and the door opened. "Grandmother, what big arms you've got!"
"All the better to hug you with, my dear."
"Grandmother, what big ears you have!"
"All the better to hear you with, my child."
"Grandmother, what big eyes you've got!"
"All the better to see you with, my child."
"And grandmother, what big teeth you've got!"
"All the better to eat you up with."
Fortunately, a hunter was passing nearby the hut. He heard the wolf and recognized him right away. He ran over to the window. He took a good aim, and that was the end of the wolf.
By the Brothers Grimm. Hello, this is Natasha, and I'm dropping by with a famous fairy tale. Now, Bertie's friend, Sadie the Swan, tells me that she's met one or two fellows like the man in this story. At first, he makes himself very useful and helpful to a girl, but later on he becomes a bit of a pest. His name is Rumpelstiltskin. Once upon a time, there was a miller who was very poor, but who had a beautiful daughter. Now it happened that he had an audience with the king, and in order to make himself appear as a person of importance, he said to him, "I have a daughter who can spin straw into gold." The king said to the miller, "That is an art which pleases me well. If your daughter is as clever as you say, bring her tomorrow to my palace, and I will try what she can do." And when the girl was brought to him, he took her into a room which was quite full of straw, gave her a spinning wheel and a reel, and said, "Now set to work, and if by tomorrow morning early you have not spun this straw into gold during the night, you must die." Thereupon he himself locked up the room and left her in it alone. So there sat the poor miller's daughter, and for the life of her could not tell what to do. She had no idea how straw could be spun into gold, and she grew more and more miserable, until at last she began to weep. But all at once the door opened, and in came a little man and said, "Good evening, Mistress Miller. Why are you crying so?" "Alas," answered the girl, "I have to spin straw into gold, and I do not know how to do it."
"What will you give me," said the mannikin, "if I do it for you?"
"My necklace," said the girl. The little man took the necklace, seated himself in front of the wheel, and whirr, 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 3 turns, and the reel was full. Then he put another on, and whirr, 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 3 times round, and the second was full too. And so it went on until the morning, when all the straw was spun, and all the reels were full of gold. By daybreak the king was already there, and when he saw the gold he was astonished and delighted. But his heart became only more greedy. He had the miller's daughter taken into another room full of straw, which was much larger, and commanded her to spin that also in one night if she valued her life. The girl knew not how to help herself, and was crying, when the door again opened, and the little man appeared and said, "What will you give me if I spin that straw into gold for you?" "The ring on my finger," answered the girl. The little man took the ring, and again began to turn the wheel, and by morning had spun all the straw into glittering gold. The king rejoiced beyond measure at the sight, but still he had not gold enough, and he had the miller's daughter taken into a still larger room full of straw, and said, "You must spin this too in the course of the night. But if you succeed, you shall be my wife." Even if she be a miller's daughter, thought he, I could not find a richer wife in the whole world. When the girl was alone, the mannikin came again for the 3rd time and said, "What will you give me if I spin the straw for you this time also?" "I have nothing left that I could give," answered the girl. "Then promise me, if you should become queen, your first child." "Who knows whether that will ever happen?" thought the miller's daughter, and not knowing how else to help herself in this strait, she promised the mannikin what he wanted, and for that he once more span the straw into gold. And when the king came in the morning and found all as he had wished, he took her in marriage, and the pretty miller's daughter became a queen. A year after, she had a beautiful child, and she never gave a thought to the mannikin. But suddenly, one day, he came into her room and said, "Now give me what you promised." The queen was horror-struck, and offered the mannikin all the riches of the kingdom if he would leave her the child. But the mannikin said, "No, something that is living is dearer to me than all the treasures in the world." Then the queen began to weep and cry, so that the mannikin pitied her. "I will give you 3 days," said he. "If by that time you find out my name, then you shall keep your child." So the Queen thought the whole night of all the names that she had ever heard, and she sent a messenger over the country to inquire, far and wide, for any other names that there might be. When the mannequin came the next day, she began with Caspar, Melchior, Balthazar, and said all the names she knew one after another. But to every one the little man said, "That is not my name." On the second day she had inquiries made into the neighbourhood as to the names of the people there, and she repeated to the mannequin the most uncommon and curious. "Perhaps your name is Shortribs or Sheepshanks or Laceleg." But he always answered, "That is not my name." On the third day the messenger came back again and said, "I have not been able to find a single new name, but as I came to a high mountain at the end of the forest, where the fox and the hare bid each other good night, there I saw a little house, and before the house a fire was burning, and round about the fire quite a ridiculous little man was jumping. He hopped upon one leg and shouted, 'Today I bake, tomorrow brew, the next I'll have the young Queen's child. Ha! Glad am I that no one knew that Rumpelstiltskin I am styled.' You may think how glad the Queen was when she heard the name, and when soon afterwards the little man came in and asked, 'Now, Mistress Queen, what is my name?' At first she said, 'Is your name Conrad?' 'No.' 'Is your name Harry?' 'No.' 'Perhaps your name is Rumpelstiltskin?' 'The devil told you that! The devil told you that!' cried the little man, and in his anger he plunged his right foot so deep into the earth that his whole leg went in, and then in rage he pulled at his left leg so hard with both hands that he tore himself in two. And that was the story of Rumpelstiltskin by the Brothers Grimm. And make sure you never get into a rage like that. But you would never be as naughty as Rumpelstiltskin, would you? So, until you drop by next time at storynori.com, from me, Natasha, bye-bye!
Hansel and Gretel. Hi everybody, my name is Natasha, and I've been commanded by His Royal Highness Prince Bertie the Frog to tell you a story Nori. It's a rather scary story. Do you like rather scary stories? You won't be frightened, will you? Just a bit? Because you know, I think I'm going to be just a bit scared when I tell you about the wicked witch who liked to eat little children. So listen quietly, and I will tell you the story Nori of Hansel and Gretel from Andrew Lang's Blue Fairy Book. Once upon a time, there lived on the outskirts of a large forest a poor woodcutter with his wife and 2 children. The boy was called Hansel and the girl Gretel. He always had very little money, even to buy food, and once, when times were really bad, they had to get by with 1 piece of bread and butter each day. One night, as he was tossing about in bed, full of cares and worry, he sighed and said to his wife, "What's to become of us? How are we to feed our poor children now that we have nothing more for ourselves?" "I'll tell you what, husband," answered the woman. "Early tomorrow morning, we'll take the children out into the thickest part of the wood. There we shall light a fire for them and give them each a piece of bread. Then we'll go on to our work and leave them alone. They won't be able to find their way home, and we shall be rid of them." "No, wife," said her husband, "that I won't do. How could I find it in my heart to leave my children alone in the wood? The wild beasts would soon come and tear them to pieces." "Oh, you fool," said she. "Then we must all four die of hunger, and you may just as well go and saw the wood for our coffins." And they argued and argued until he agreed that they must get rid of Hansel and Gretel. "But I can't help feeling sorry for the poor children," added the husband. The children, too, had not been able to sleep for hunger and had heard what their stepmother had said to her father. Gretel wept bitterly and spoke to Hansel. "Now it's all over for us." "No, no, Gretel," said Hansel. "Don't worry. I'll find a way to escape. No fear." And when the parents had fallen asleep, he got up, slipped on his little coat, opened the back door, and crept out. The moon was shining clearly, and the white pebbles which lay in front of the house glittered like bits of silver. Hansel bent down and filled his pocket with as many of them as he could cram in. Then he went back and said to Gretel, "It's all right, my dear little sister, and go to sleep. God will not desert us." And he lay down in bed again. At daybreak, even before the sun was up, the woman came and woke the two children. "Get up, you sleepyheads. We're all going to the forest to fetch wood." She gave them each a bit of bread and said, "There's something for your lunch, but don't you eat it up before lunchtime, because it's all you'll get." Gretel took the bread under her apron, as Hansel had the stones in his pocket. Then they all set out together on the way to the forest. After they had walked for a little, Hansel stood still and looked back at the house, and all the while he kept on holding back again and again. His father observed him and said, "Hansel, what are you gazing at there? And why do you always remain behind? Take care and don't lose your way." "Oh, father," said Hansel, "I'm looking back at my white kitten, which is sitting on the roof, waving me bye-bye." The woman exclaimed, "What a donkey you are! That isn't your kitten. That's the morning sun shining on the chimney." But Hansel had not looked back at his kitten. But each time he stopped, he had dropped one of the white pebbles out of his pocket to mark the way back home, so that he and little Gretel could not get lost in the woods. When they had reached the middle of the forest, the father said, "Now, children, go and fetch a lot of wood, and I'll light a fire that you may not feel cold." Hansel and Gretel heaped up brushwood till they had made a pile nearly the size of a small hill. The brushwood was set fire to, and when the flames leaped high, the woman said, "Now lie down at the fire, children, and rest yourselves. We are going into the forest to cut down wood. When we've finished, we'll come back and fetch you." But instead, the old parents crept back to their cottage, leaving the children behind. Hansel and Gretel sat down beside the fire, and at midday ate their little bits of bread. And when they had sat for a long time, their eyes closed with tiredness, and they fell fast asleep. When they awoke at last, it was pitch dark. Gretel began to cry and said, "How are we ever going to get out of the wood?" But Hansel comforted her. "Wait a bit," he said, "till the moon is up, and then we'll find our way sure enough." And when the full moon had risen, he took his sister by the hand and followed the pebbles, which shone like bright new coins, and showed them the path. They walked on through the night, and at daybreak reached their father's house again. They knocked at the door, and when the woman opened it, she exclaimed, "You naughty children! What a long time you've slept in the wood! We thought you were never going to come back." But the father rejoiced, for he felt guilty for leaving his children behind them. Not long afterward, there was again a great shortage of food in the land, and the children heard their mother speak to their father in bed one night like this: "Everything is eaten up once more. We have only half a loaf of bread in the house, and when that's done, it's all up with us. The children must be got rid of. We'll lead them deeper into the wood this time, so that they won't be able to find their way out again. There's no other way of saving ourselves." The man's heart felt heavy, and he thought, surely it would be better to share the last bite with one's children. But his wife wouldn't listen to his arguments, and they quarrelled for a long time until the old man finally agreed that the children had to be got rid of, although he was very sad about it. But the children were awake and had heard the conversation. When the old people were asleep, Hansel got up and wanted to go out and pick up pebbles again, as he had done the first time. But the woman had barred the door, and Hansel couldn't get out. But he consoled his little sister and said, "Don't cry, Gretel, and sleep peacefully, for God is sure to help us." At early dawn, the woman came and made the children get up. She gave them their bit of bread, but it was even smaller than the time before. On the way to the wood, Hansel crumbled it in his pocket, and every few minutes he stood still and dropped a crumb on the ground. "Hansel, what are you stopping and looking about you for?" said the father. "I'm looking back at my little pigeon, which is sitting on the roof waving me farewell," answered Hansel. "Fool!" said the wife. "That isn't your pigeon. It's the morning sun glittering on the chimney." But Hansel gradually threw all his crumbs on the path. The woman led the children still deeper into the forest, farther than they had ever been in their lives before. Then a big fire was lit again, and the mother said, "Just sit down there, children, and if you're tired you can sleep a bit. We're going into the forest to cut down wood, and in the evening when we're finished we'll come back to fetch you." At midday, Gretel divided her bread with Hansel, for he had strewn it all along their path. Then they fell asleep, and evening passed away, but nobody came to the poor children. They didn't wake till it was pitch dark, and Hansel comforted his sister, saying, "Only wait, Gretel, till the moon rises. Then we shall see the breadcrumbs that are scattered along the path. They will show us back to the house." When the moon appeared, they got up, but they found no crumbs, for the thousands of birds that fly about the woods and fields had picked them all up. "Never mind," said Hansel to Gretel. "You'll see we'll find a way out." But all the same they did not. They wandered about the whole night, and the next day from morning till evening, but they could not find a path out of the wood. They were very hungry too, for they had nothing to eat but a few berries they found growing on the ground. And at last they were so tired that their legs refused to carry them any longer, so they lay down under a tree and fell fast asleep. On the third morning, after they had left their father's house, they set about their wandering again, but only got deeper and deeper into the wood. And now they felt that if help did not come to them soon, they must perish. At midday, they saw a beautiful little snow-white bird sitting on a branch, which sang so sweetly that they stopped still and listened to it. And when its song was finished, it flapped its wings and flew on in front of them. They followed it and came to a little house, on the roof of which it perched. And when they came quite near, they saw that the cottage was made of bread and roofed with cakes, while the window was made of transparent sugar. "Now we'll tuck in," said Hansel, "and stuff our faces with the food. I'll eat a bit of the roof, and you, Gretel, can eat some of the window, which you'll find a tasty little snack." Hansel stretched up his hand and broke off a little bit of the roof to see what it was like, and Gretel went to the window and began to nibble at it. At that moment, a shrill voice came out from the room inside. "Nibble, nibble, little mouse, who's nibbling at my house?" The children answered, "'Tis heaven's own child, the tempest wild," and went on eating, for they were ever so hungry, and Hansel in particular had rather bad manners. He was thoroughly enjoying eating the roof, and tore down a big bit of it, while Gretel pushed out a whole round window pane and sat down the better to enjoy it. Suddenly the door opened, and an ancient woman was leaning on a stick hobbled out. Hansel and Gretel were so terrified that they let what they had in their hands fall. But the old woman shook her head and said, "Oh ho, you dear children, who led you here? Just come in and stay with me. No harm shall happen to you." She took them both by the hand and led them into the house, and laid a most delicious dinner before them, milk and sugared pancakes with apples and nuts. After they had finished, 2 beautiful little white beds were prepared for them, and when Hansel and Gretel lay down in them, they felt as if they had got into heaven. The old woman appeared to be most friendly, but she was really an old witch who used to steal children, and had only built the little bread house in order to lure them in. When anyone came into her power, she killed, cooked, and ate him or her, and held a regular feast day for the occasion. Now witches have red eyes, and cannot see far, but like beasts, they have a keen sense of smell, and know when human beings pass by. When Hansel and Gretel fell into her hands, she laughed wickedly and said jeeringly, "I've got them now. They shan't escape me." Early in the morning, before the children were awake, she rose up, and when she saw them both sleeping so peacefully with their round rosy cheeks, she muttered to herself, "That'll be a dainty bite to eat." Then she seized Hansel with her bony hand and carried him into the little stable and locked the door on him. He might scream as much as he liked. It did him no good. Then she went to Gretel, shook her till she awoke, and cried, "Get up, you lazy bones! Fetch water and cook something for your brother. When he's fat, I'll eat him up." Gretel began to cry bitterly, but it was of no use. She had to do what she was told. So the best food was cooked for poor Hansel, but Gretel got nothing but crab shells. Every morning the old woman hobbled out to the stable and cried, "Hansel, put out your finger that I may feel if you are getting fat." But Hansel always stretched out an old bone, and the old dame, whose eyes were dim, couldn't see it, and thinking always it was Hansel's finger, wondered why he fattened slowly. When 4 weeks had passed, and Hansel still remained thin, she lost patience and decided to wait no longer. "Hi, Gretel," she called to the girl. "Be quick and get some water. Hansel may be fat or thin. I'm going to kill him tomorrow or cook him." Oh, how the poor little sister sobbed as she carried the water, and how the tears rolled down her cheeks. "Kind heaven, help us now," she cried. "If only the wild beasts in the wood had eaten us, then at least we should have died together." "Just hold your peace," said the old hag. "It won't help you." Early in the morning, Gretel had to go out and hang up the kettle full of water and light the fire. "First, we'll make a pie," said the old witch. "I've heated the oven already and rolled the pastry." She pushed Gretel out to the oven, from which fiery flames were already jumping. "Creep in," said the witch, "and see if it's properly heated, so that we can shove in the pie." For when she had got Gretel in, she meant to close the oven and let the girl roast, that she might eat her up too. But Gretel saw through her wicked trick and said, "I don't know how I'm going to do it. How do I get in?" "You silly goose," said the old hag. "The opening is big enough. See, I could get in myself." And she crawled toward it and poked her head in the oven. Then Gretel gave her a shove that sent her right in, shut the iron door and drew the bolt. Gracious! How she yelled! But Gretel fled, and the wretched old woman was left to roast in her own oven. Gretel flew straight to Hansel, opened the little stable door and cried, "Hansel, we are free! The old witch is dead!" Then Hansel sprang like a bird out of a cage when the door is opened. How happy they were! They jumped for joy and hugged and kissed one another. And as they had no longer any cause for fear, they went into the old hag's house. And here they found, in every corner of the room, boxes with pearls and precious stones. "These are even better than pebbles," said Hansel, and crammed his pockets full of them. And Gretel said, "I too will bring some home," and she filled her apron full. "But now," said Hansel, "let's go and get well away from the witch's wood." When they had wandered about for some hours, they came to a big lake. "We can't get over," said Hansel. "I see no bridge of any sort or kind." "Yes, and there's no ferry boat either," answered Gretel. "But look, there swims a white duck. If I ask her, she'll help us over." And she called out, "Here are two sad children who can't cross the lake to get home because there is no bridge nor ferry boat. Take us upon your white back and row us over. Quack, quack!" The duck swam toward them, and Hansel got on her back and told his little sister to sit beside him. "No," answered Gretel. "We should be too heavy a load for the duck. She shall carry us across separately." The good bird did this, and when they were landed safely on the other side and had walked for a while, the wood became more and more familiar to them, and at last they saw their father's house in the distance. Then they set off to run, and bounding into the room jumped up to hug their father. The man had not passed a happy hour since he had left them in the wood, but his wife had died. Gretel shook out her apron so that the pearls and precious stones rolled about the room, and Hansel threw down one handful after the other out of his pocket. And so all their troubles were ended, and they lived happily ever after. And that's the story, Nori, of Hansel and Gretel. I'm glad it all ended happily, at least for Hansel and Gretel and their father, even if the wicked witch did get roasted in her own oven. Prince Bertie the Frog would like to meet all his new friends at his lovely green and purple website. You can see what he looks like there. So drop by at storynori.com. I'll be telling you another story, Nori, soon. So for now, from me, Natasha, Cinderella.
Bye-bye.
Hello, everybody. My name is Natasha, and His Royal Highness Prince Bertie the Frog has commanded me to tell you the story, Nori, of Cinderella. As you probably know, Bertie used to be a royal prince, but now he's a frog and lives on a pond. This morning, I heard Sadie the swan sigh and say, "You know, Bertie, in her heart, every girl dreams that one day she shall meet her handsome prince."
"Well, they are just silly," interrupted Colin the carp, who was a very grumpy fish. "Why can't they ever wish to meet a handsome carp? That's what I'd like to know."
"Oh, Colin," said Sadie, "you have no idea." Well, to help Colin get a better idea of what really goes on in every girl's heart, I'm going to tell you and all the pond life a very famous fairy tale about a girl's wish that did come true. It's called Cinderella. Once upon a time, there was a gentleman who married for his second wife the proudest and most haughty woman there ever was. She had been married before and already had 2 daughters who were exactly like her in all things. He had likewise by his first wife a young daughter, but of unequalled goodness and sweetness of temper, which she took from her mother, who was the best creature in the world. This sweet little girl missed her mother, who had died, ever so much. No sooner was the wedding ceremony over than the new wife began to show herself in her true colours. She could not bear the goodness of the gentleman's pretty girl, and especially as she made her own daughters appear the more horrid. She made her do the meanest jobs in the house. The girl scoured the dishes and tables, and scrubbed the stepmother's bathroom and those of her daughters. She slept in a little attic upon a wretched straw bed, while her sisters lay upon beds with the softest pillows in fine rooms, with floors covered with beautiful carpets, and walls on which hung looking-glasses so large that they might see themselves at their full length from head to foot. As she was doing this, they said to her, "Cinderella, would you not be glad to go to the ball?" "Alas," said she, "you only jeer me. It is not for a poor girl like me to go there." "You're quite right," replied they. "It would make the people laugh to see a cinder wench at a ball." Anyone but Cinderella would have dressed their heads all wrong, but she was very good and dressed them perfectly well. The step-sisters were almost 2 days without eating. So much were they thrilled and excited. They broke above a dozen corsets in trying to be laced up tightly so that they might have a fine, slender shape, and they were continually at their looking-glass. At last, the happy day came. They went to court, and Cinderella followed them with her eyes as long as she could, and when she had lost sight of them, she fell a-crying. Just then, her fairy godmother, who used to watch over her secretly, saw her all in tears, and appeared at her side, and asked her what was the matter. I wish I could. She was not able to speak the rest, being interrupted by her tears and sobbing. This fairy godmother of hers said to her, "You wish you could go to the ball, is it not so?" "Yes," cried Cinderella with a great sigh. "Well," said her godmother, "be but a good girl, and I will see that you shall go to the ball." Then she took her into her secret room and said to her, "Run into the garden and bring me a pumpkin." Cinderella went immediately to gather the finest she could and brought it to her godmother, not being able to imagine how this pumpkin could make her go to the ball. Her godmother scooped out all the inside of the big vegetable, leaving nothing but the rind, which done, she struck it with her wand, and the pumpkin was instantly turned into a fine coach, gilded all over with gold. She then went to look into her mouse-trap, where she found 6 mice, all alive, and ordered Cinderella to lift up a little the trap-door. As each mouse went out, she gave it a little tap with her wand, and the mouse was that moment turned into a fine horse, which altogether made a very fine set of 6 horses of a beautiful mouse-coloured dapple grey. But they still needed a coachman. "I will go and see," says Cinderella, "if there is a rat in the rat trap. We may make a coachman of him." "You're a smart one," replied her godmother. "Go and look." Cinderella brought the trap to her, and in it there were 3 huge rats. The fairy made choice of one of the 3 which had the largest beard, and having touched him with her wand, he was turned into a fat, jolly coachman, who had the smartest whiskers eyes ever beheld. After that, she said to her, "Go again into the garden, and you will find 6 lizards behind the watering pot. Bring them to me." She had no sooner done so, but her godmother turned them into 6 footmen, who skipped up immediately behind the coach, with their uniforms all bedaubed with gold and silver, and clung as close behind each other as if they had done nothing else their whole lives. The fairy then said to Cinderella, "Well, you have here transport fit to take you to the ball. Are you not pleased with it?" "Oh, yes," cried she. "But must I go there as I am, in these nasty rags?" Her godmother only just touched her with her wand, and at the same instant her clothes were turned into a cloth of gold and silver, all beset with jewels. This done, she gave her a pair of glass slippers, the prettiest in the whole world. Being thus decked out, she got up into her coach, but her godmother, above all things, commanded her not to stay till after midnight, telling her at the same time that if she stayed 1 moment longer, the coach would be a pumpkin again, her horses mice, her coachman a rat, her footmen lizards, and her clothes become just as they were before. She promised her godmother she would not fail of leaving the ball before midnight. Then off she went to the ball, scarce able to contain herself for joy. The king's son, who was told that a great princess whom nobody knew was to come, ran out to receive her. He gave her his hand as she alighted out of the coach, and led her into the ball amongst all the company. There was immediately a profound silence. The dancing stopped, and the violins ceased to play. So attentive was everyone to contemplate the singular beauty of the unknown newcomer. Nothing was then heard but a confused noise of "Ah! Ha! How lovely she is! Ha! How lovely she is!" The king himself, old as he was, could not help watching her, and telling the queen softly that it was a long time since he had seen so beautiful and lovely a creature. All the ladies were busied in considering her clothes and headdress, that they might have some made the next day after in the same pattern, provided they could find such fine material and as able hands to make them. The king's son led her to the most honourable seat, and afterward took her out to dance with him. She danced so very gracefully that they all the more and more admired her. A fine banquet was served up, of which the young prince ate not a morsel, so intently was he busied in gazing upon her. She went and sat down by her sisters, showing them 1,000 polite gestures, giving them part of the oranges and lemon blossoms which the prince had presented her with, which very much surprised them, for they did not recognise her. While Cinderella was thus amusing her sisters, she heard the clock strike 11 3/4, whereupon she immediately made a curtsy to the company and hasted away as fast as she could. When she got home, she ran to seek out her godmother, and after having thanked her, she said she could not but heartily wish she might go the next day to the ball, because the king's son had desired her to go. As she was eagerly telling her godmother whatever had passed at the ball, her 2 sisters knocked at the door, which Cinderella ran and opened. "How long you have stayed!" cried she, gaping, rubbing her eyes, and stretching herself as if she had been just waked out of her sleep. "If you had been at the ball," said one of her sisters, "you would not have been tired with it. There came the finest princess, the most beautiful ever was seen with mortal eyes. She was 1,000 times nice to us, and gave us oranges and lemon blossoms." Cinderella seemed very indifferent in the matter. Indeed, she asked them the name of that princess, but they told her they did not know it, and that the king's son was very uneasy on her account, and would give all the world to know who she was. At this, Cinderella, smiling, replied, "She must, then, be very beautiful indeed. How happy you have been! Could not I see her? Ah, dear Miss Charlotte, do lend me your yellow suit of clothes, which you wear every day." "I," cried Miss Charlotte, "lend my clothes to such a dirty cinder wench as you? I should be a fool." Cinderella indeed expected well such an answer, and was very glad of the refusal, for she would have been sadly put to if her sister had lent her what she had asked for jokingly. The next day the 2 sisters were at the ball, and so was Cinderella, but dressed more magnificently than before. The king's son was always by her, and never ceased his compliments and kind speeches to her, to whom all this was so far from being tiresome, that she quite forgot what her godmother had recommended to her, so that she, at last, counted the clock striking 12, when she thought it to be no more than 11. She then rose up and fled, as nimble as a deer. The prince followed, but could not overtake her. She left behind one of her glass slippers, which the prince took up most carefully. She got home, but quite out of breath, and in her nasty old clothes, having nothing left of all her finery but one of the little slippers, fellow to that she had dropped. The guards at the palace gate were asked if they had not seen a princess go out. They replied that they had seen nobody go out but a young girl, very meanly dressed, and who had more the air of a poor country wench than a gentlewoman. When the 2 sisters returned from the ball, Cinderella asked them if they had been well entertained, and if the fine lady had been there. They told her yes, but that she hurried away immediately when it struck 12, and with so much haste that she dropped one of her little glass slippers, the prettiest in the world, which the king's son had taken up, and that most certainly he was very much in love with the beautiful person who owned the glass slipper. What they said was very true, For a few days after, the king's son commanded it to be proclaimed by sound of trumpet that he would marry the young woman whose foot would perfectly fit the slipper. He sent out his most trusted advisers from the palace, who began to try it upon the princesses, then the duchesses, and all the court, but in vain. It was brought to the two sisters, who each did all that she possibly could to thrust her foot into the slipper, but neither sister could manage to do so. Cinderella, who saw all this and knew her slipper, said to them laughing, "Let me see if it will not fit me." Her sisters burst out laughing and began to tease her. The gentleman who was sent to try the slipper looked earnestly at Cinderella, and finding her very handsome, said it was only right that she should try, and that he had orders to let every girl try. He asked Cinderella to sit down, and putting the slipper to her foot, he found it went on very easily, and fitted her as if it had been made of wax. The astonishment her two sisters were in was excessively great, but still abundantly greater when Cinderella pulled out of her pocket the other slipper and put it on her foot. Thereupon in came her godmother, who, having touched with her wand Cinderella's clothes, made them richer and more magnificent than any of those she had seen before. And now her two sisters found her to be that fine, beautiful lady whom they had seen at the ball. They threw themselves at her feet to beg for pardon for all the ill treatment they had dished out to her. Cinderella took them up, and as she embraced them cried that she forgave them with all her heart, and desired them always to love her. She was brought by carriage to the young prince, dressed as she was. He thought her more charming than ever, and a few days after married her. Cinderella was brought by carriage to the young prince, dressed as she was. He thought her more charming than ever, and a few days after married her. Cinderella, who was no less good than beautiful, gave her two sisters rooms in the palace, and that very same day matched them with two great lords of the court. And that's the story of Cinderella. And Sadie the Swan has just whispered that she believes that every girl will meet her prince one day. And hopefully, adds Colin the Carp, one that hasn't been turned into a frog. You can find out about more Prince Bertie the Frog stories at storynori.com, where all Prince Bertie the Frog stories are free. And if you like, you can buy a personalised story for a very special person in your life. So tell all your friends to visit storynori.com. For now, from me, Natasha.
The Golden
Bye
Goose
bye.
by the Brothers Grimm. Hello, this is Natasha, and I am dropping by with the tale of The Golden Goose by the Brothers Grimm. Bertie says that if you've heard Lazy Jack on Story Nori, you'll notice that there are a few things in this tale that are a bit similar. But in other ways, it's also quite different. So see if you can spot what's the same and what's not. Once upon a time, there lived a woodcutter and his wife who had 3 sons. The eldest 2 were strong and tall, and their mother and father were always telling them how handsome and clever they were. But the youngest son was, to tell you the truth, just a bit simple in the head. He wasn't very tall, and he wasn't very strong, and his family thought he was good for nothing. They hardly ever called him by his real name, but instead they gave him a cruel nickname. They called him Dummy, because they said he was stupid. One day, the eldest son wanted to go to the forest to cut wood. The mother praised him for being such a useful boy, and before he set out, she gave him some of her best fruit cake for his lunch and a bottle of wine to wash it down. While the boy was walking through the forest, he met a little grey old man who said to him,
"Do give me a little piece of your cake and a swig of your wine. I'm so terribly hungry and thirsty."
And the eldest son replied, "Be off with you, you filthy old beggar!" And the little grey old man went away, but not without taking his revenge. He put a curse on the boy, so that when he started to cut down a tree, his axe slipped and went into his leg. The boy limped home to his mother, who washed his wound and bandaged him. The next day, the second eldest son went out into the forest to cut wood. Before he set out, his mother praised him for being such a useful boy, but especially asked him to be careful with the axe, so as not to have a nasty accident like his brother. The boy promised not to be careless, and his mother gave him some of her best sponge cake for his lunch and a bottle of wine to wash it down with. It happened that as the boy was walking through the woods, he came across the same little grey old man. The man said to him,
"Do please share your sponge cake and your wine with me, for I am so terribly weak with hunger and thirst."
And the boy said, "Be off with you, you lazy old scoundrel. If you want to eat, you'd better work." And the little grey old man went away, but not without taking his revenge. Not long after, when the boy was cutting down a tree, his axe flew out of his hand and hit him on the head. He crawled home to his mother, who bandaged up his wound and asked him why he had not kept his promise to be more careful. For the rest of the week, the two eldest sons were both lying in bed recovering from their wounds. The father said to the third and youngest son, "Get on your feet, you lazy dummy. Why are you sitting around doing nothing when both brothers are hurt and unable to work? Get out to the forest and cut some wood, if you're not too stupid to do that." The mother laughed at him and said, "It's more likely that Dummy will cut his own head off, but it won't be much of a loss to anyone." And before he left, she gave him some cake that she had burnt almost to a crust in the oven, and a bottle of sour beer to wash it down. As the youngest boy was going through the woods, he met the same little grey old man who had crossed the path of his brothers. The man said to him,
"Do please share some of your cake and beer with me. I am so terribly hungry and thirsty, and I fear that if I don't have something to eat and drink soon, I will surely die."
The young boy replied, "Old man, I will gladly share with you what I have, but the cake is burnt and the beer is sour."
"Never mind that," said the man. "I am grateful for what you can give me."
And the boy and the little grey old man sat down and shared the cake and the beer. After they had finished their lunch, the man said,
"Since you have a good heart and have shared what you have with me, I will give you a reward. You see that tree over there? Cut it down with your axe, and you will find something of value inside its hollow trunk."
And so, when the little grey old man had left, the young boy, whose parents called him Dummy, took his axe and cut down the hollow tree just as he had been told. Inside he found a goose, but this was no ordinary bird, for its feathers were made of gold. The boy realised that he was in luck and thought to himself, "Why should I go home now and suffer the insults of my parents and brothers? They will take this valuable bird from me, and I shall have nothing." And so the boy decided to run away from home. He put the golden goose under his arm and set out for the town. Then he went to the inn, intending to stay there. He stood at the bar and asked the innkeeper if he would accept a golden feather as payment for his board and lodgings. When the innkeeper saw the golden goose, he readily agreed. But after the boy had gone to bed, he said to his 3 daughters, "That young boy, whose parents call him Dummy, is staying up in our guest room. But he can't be simple in the head as they say, for he's got a valuable bird with him, a goose with feathers made of gold." The eldest daughter thought to herself, well, fancy that. Feathers made of gold. I'll pluck 1 or maybe more of those for myself. After the clock struck midnight, she sneaked into the boy's room and saw that he was asleep with his arm around the golden goose. She crept up and tried to pluck a feather, but the feather wouldn't budge, and when she tried to take her hand away, she found that she was stuck to it. She couldn't move, and she couldn't cry out for fear of waking the boy. She had to stay where she was, on her knees by the bed, with her hand on the feather. After the clock struck 1 in the morning, the second sister came into the room, planning to take 1 feather or more for herself. In the dark she didn't see her sister, but as soon as she touched her back, she found that her hand was stuck fast to her, and she had to stay exactly where she was, not moving and not making a sound. After the clock struck 2 in the morning, the third sister came in. The other 2 shouted, "Stay back!" But it was too late. She reached out, hoping to steal the feather, and found that her hand was stuck to the middle sister. The boy and the goose slept soundly through all of this. In the morning, the boy got up, paid his bill with the golden feather, and left the inn with the goose under his arm. The sisters had no choice but to follow on behind him. A pretty procession they made. Along the way, they met the bishop.
"What a sight!"
he exclaimed.
"It's hardly right for 3 young women to follow a boy round like that."
And as the girls went past, he tapped the youngest on the shoulder. In doing so, he found that he was also stuck to her and had to follow. Further up the road, they met a police sergeant. The bishop called out to him,
"Sergeant, help me get free from this young woman's shoulder. I'm stuck to her, and people are bound to start all kind of gossip about it."
The police sergeant tried to pull the bishop free, but in doing so he found that both his hands stuck to his waist, and he had to follow along with the procession too. At the top of the road they met the mayor.
"What's this town coming to?"
cried the mayor.
"The bishop and the police sergeant following 3 young girls who are following a young boy all holding on to each other in a most unseemly fashion. Have they all gone mad?"
As he spoke, he tried to pull the police sergeant and the bishop away, but in doing so, he found that he was stuck to both of them and had to follow on. The boy led the little line of townspeople up along the road, and at the top of the hill they passed the king's palace. Now the king's daughter was very beautiful, but she had the saddest face in the whole wide world. She had never laughed and not even once smiled. The king was so troubled by the young princess's unhappiness that he had made a special law. Whosoever could make her laugh and smile would win her hand in marriage. But the truth was that nothing very funny ever happened inside the royal palace. All the king's servants and advisers were far too high and mighty to understand what would make a young girl laugh, or indeed to allow anything amusing to happen at all. As the boy, known as Dummy, went past the palace, he still held the Golden Goose under his arm, and he was followed by the innkeeper's 3 daughters, the bishop, the police sergeant, and the mayor. The princess looked out and saw the important people in their uniforms being tugged along behind 3 girls and a boy with a goose, and she thought that it was the first thing she had seen in her life that was truly funny. She burst out laughing and ran, still giggling, to her father to tell him all about what she had seen. When the king looked out of his window and saw the procession, he couldn't help laughing himself. He sent for his guards and told them to bring the boy and his followers directly to him. When the boy entered the king's chamber with the followers behind him, the mayor, the bishop, and the policeman all called out angrily that he should pay for his crime with his head. The king, still laughing, said that on the contrary, he would be rewarded with the hand in marriage of his daughter, the princess. For an entire week after that, the innkeeper's 3 daughters, the bishop, the policeman, and the mayor were all stuck to the Golden Goose and to one another. And while they were stuck, all the townspeople and the whole court laughed and smiled at them. And the boy, whose family called him Dummy, married the princess and inherited the kingdom. He lived with his beautiful wife, and they had 6 happy, smiling children, and the palace was often filled with laughter. And that was the story of the Golden Goose by the Brothers Grimm. And don't forget, there are loads more stories on storynori.com. So until next time, from me, Natasha,
Rapunzel
bye-bye.
by the Brothers Grimm. Hello, this is Natasha, and I'm dropping by with a famous fairy tale about a girl whose hair was not only beautiful, but it was very useful too. It was so long that a prince could use it as a ladder to climb up to her in her tower. The story is called Rapunzel. There was once a man and a woman who had long wished for a child, but without any luck. At last the woman hoped that God was about to grant her desire. They had a little window at the back of their house, from which a splendid garden could be seen, which was full of the most beautiful flowers and herbs. It was, however, surrounded by a high wall, and no one dared go into it because it belonged to an enchantress who had great power and was dreaded by all the world. One day the woman was standing by this window and looking down into the garden, when she saw a bed which was planted with the most beautiful plant called Rapunzel. and it looked so fresh and green that she longed for it. She quite pined away, and began to look pale and miserable. Then her husband was alarmed and asked, "What troubles you, dear wife?" "Ah," she replied, "if I can't eat some of the Rapunzel, which is in the garden behind our house, I shall die." The man who loved her thought, "Sooner than let your wife die, better bring her some of the Rapunzel, let it cost you what it will." When it was getting dark, he clambered down over the wall into the garden of the enchantress, hastily clutched a handful of the Rapunzel plant and took it to his wife. She at once made herself a salad of it and ate it greedily. It tasted so good to her, so very good, that the next day she longed for it 3 times as much as before. If he was to have any rest, her husband must once more descend into the garden. In the gloom of the evening, therefore, he let himself down again. But when he had clambered down the wall, he was struck with terror, for he saw the enchantress standing before him. "How can you dare," said she with an angry look, "climb down into my garden and steal my Rapunzel like a thief? You shall suffer for it." "Ah," answered he, "let mercy take the place of justice. I only made up my mind to do it out of necessity. My wife saw your Rapunzel from the window, and felt such a longing for it that she would have died if she had not got some to eat." Then the enchantress allowed her anger to be softened, and said to him, "If you speak the truth, I will allow you to take away with you as much Rapunzel as you will. Only I make one condition. You must give me the child which your wife will bring into the world. It will be treated well, and I will care for it like a mother." The man, in his terror, agreed to everything. And when the child was born, the enchantress appeared at once, gave the child the name of Rapunzel, and took it away with her. Rapunzel grew into the most beautiful child under the sun. When she was 12 years old, the enchantress shut her into a tower, which lay in a forest, and it had neither stairs nor doors, but right at the top was a little window. When the enchantress wanted to go in, she placed herself beneath it and cried, "Rapunzel! Rapunzel! Let down your hair for me." Rapunzel had magnificent long hair, fine as spun gold, and when she heard the voice of the enchantress, she unfastened her braided tresses, wound them round one of the hooks of the window above, and then the hair fell 20 yards down, and the enchantress climbed up by it. After a year or 2, it happened that the king's son rode through the forest and passed by the tower. Then he heard a song, which was so charming that he stood still and listened. This was Rapunzel, who in her solitude passed her time in letting her sweet voice sing out. The king's son wanted to climb up to her, and looked for the door of the tower, but none was to be found. He rode home, but the singing had so deeply touched his heart that every day he went out into the forest and listened to it. Once, when he was thus standing behind a tree, he saw that an enchantress came there, and he heard how she cried,
Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair for me. Then Rapunzel let down the braids of her hair, and the enchantress climbed up to her. "If that is the ladder that leads to the top, I too will try my fortune," said he. And the next day, when it began to grow dark, he went to the tower and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair to me." Immediately the hair fell down, and the prince climbed up. At first Rapunzel was terribly frightened when a man, such as her eyes had never yet beheld, came to her. But the king's son began to talk to her quite like a friend, and told her that his heart had been so stirred that it had let him have no rest, and he had been forced to see her. Then Rapunzel lost her fear, and when he asked if she would take him for her husband, and she saw that he was young and handsome, she thought, "He will love me more than old Dame Gothel the enchantress does." And she said yes, and laid her hand on his. She said, "I will willingly go away with you, but I do not know how to get down. Bring with you a ball of silk every time that you come, and I will weave a ladder with it. And when that is ready, I will climb down, and you will take me on your horse." They agreed that until that time he should come to her every evening, for the old woman came by day. The enchantress remarked nothing of this, until once Rapunzel said to her, "Tell me, Dame Gothel, how it happens that you are so much heavier for me to draw up than the young king's son. He is with me in a moment." "Ah, you wicked child!" cried the enchantress. "What do I hear you say? I thought I had separated you from all the world, and yet you have deceived me." In her anger she clutched Rapunzel's beautiful hair, wrapped it twice around her left hand, seized a pair of scissors with the right, and snip, snap, they were cut off, and the lovely braids lay on the ground. And she was so pitiless that she took poor Rapunzel into a desert, where she had to live in great grief and misery. On the same day that she cast out Rapunzel, however, the enchantress fastened the braids of hair, which she had cut off, to the hook of the window, and when the king's son came and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair to me," she let the hair down. The king's son climbed, but instead of finding his dearest Rapunzel, he found the enchantress, who gazed at him with wicked and poisonous looks. "Ah!" she cried mockingly, "you would fetch your dearest, but the beautiful bird sits no longer singing in the nest. The cat has got it, and will scratch out your eyes as well. Rapunzel is lost to you. You will never see her again." The king's son was beside himself with pain, and in his despair he leapt down from the tower. He escaped with his life, but the thorns into which he fell pierced his eyes. Then he wandered quite blind about the forest, ate nothing but roots and berries, and did naught but weep over the loss of his dearest wife. Thus he roamed about in misery for some years, and at last came to the desert where Rapunzel, with the twins to which she had given birth, a boy and a girl, lived in wretchedness. He heard a voice, and it seemed so familiar to him that he went towards it. 2 of her tears wetted his eyes, and they grew clear again, and he could see with them as he did before. He led her to his kingdom, where he was joyfully received, and they lived for a long time afterwards, happy and contented. And that was the story of Rapunzel by the Brothers Grimm. Anytime you have a spare moment, drop by at storynori.com, where you will find loads more stories. We have famous stories which you might have heard before, but I hope you'll enjoy listening to them again. And we have lots of new stories too. So come by and listen. Until then, from me, Natasha, bye-bye.
Hello everybody. This is Natasha, and His Royal Highness Prince Bertie the Frog has commanded me to tell you the story Nori of Snow White by the Brothers Grimm. The story of Snow White is about a beautiful princess who had the most nasty, horrible stepmother who ever lived. Bertie thinks it's rather interesting, as the wicked queen in the story reminds him of someone he knows, a certain horrid somebody who turned him into a frog just as he was about to marry the lovely Princess Beatrice. Now, in real life, most stepmothers are sweet and kind, but the ones who appear in fairy tales are generally horrid. See what you think about this one. A very long time ago, in midwinter, when the snowflakes were falling like feathers from heaven, a beautiful queen sat sewing at her window, which had a frame of black ebony. As she worked, she looked sometimes at the falling snow, and it happened that she pricked her finger with her needle, so that 3 drops of blood fell upon the snow. The queen said to herself as she looked at it, "Ah me! If only I had a dear little child who had skin as white as the snow, lips as rosy as the blood, and hair as black as the ebony window frame." Soon afterwards she had a little daughter, with skin white as snow, lips rosy as blood, and hair as black as ebony, and she was therefore called Little Snow White. But alas, when the little one was born, the good queen died. A year passed away, and the king took another wife. She was a beautiful woman, but proud and haughty, and she could not bear that anyone else should surpass her in beauty. She had a mirror, and when she stood in front of it and asked, "Mirror, mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" the mirror answered, "Thou, O Queen, art the fairest of all." And the queen was contented, because she knew the mirror could speak nothing but the truth. But as time passed on, little Snow White grew more and more beautiful, until when she was 7 years old, she was as lovely as the bright day, and still more lovely than the queen herself, so that when the lady one day asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" it answered, "O Lady Queen, though fair ye be, Snow White is fairer far to see." The queen was shocked, and grew yellow and green with envy. And from that moment, envy and pride grew in her heart like rank weeds, so that she had no peace day or night, until one day she called her huntsman and said, "Take the child away into the woods and kill her, for I can no longer bear the sight of her.
And when you return, bring with you her heart, that I may know you have obeyed my will." The huntsman dared not disobey, and he led Snow White out into the woods and placed an arrow in his bow to pierce her innocent heart. But the little girl cried and begged him, saying, "Ah, dear huntsman, leave me my life. I will run away into the wild forest and never come home again." And as she was so beautiful, the huntsman had pity on her and said, "Run away then, you poor child." While to himself he thought, "The wild beasts will soon have devoured you." And yet it seemed as if a stone had been rolled from his heart, since he now no longer had to kill her. Then as a young wild boar came rushing by, he killed it, took out its heart, and carried it home to the queen. The cook was ordered to prepare this, and the wicked queen ate it, and thought she had eaten the heart of Snow White. Poor little Snow White was now all alone in the wild wood, and so frightened was she that she trembled at every leaf that rustled. Then she began to run, and ran over sharp stones and through thorns, and the wild beasts ran past her, but did her no harm. And she kept on running until she came to a little house where she went in to rest. Inside the cottage, everything she saw was tiny, but more dainty and clean than words can tell. Upon a white-covered table stood 7 little plates, and upon each plate lay a little spoon, besides which there were 7 knives and forks and 7 little goblets. Against the wall, side by side, stood 7 little beds covered with perfectly white sheets. Snow White was so hungry and thirsty that she took a little food from each of the 7 plates and drank a few drops of wine from each goblet, for she did not wish to take everything away from one. Then, because she was so tired, she crept into one of the little beds, but it did not suit her. And then she tried the others, but one was too long, another too short, and so on, until she came to the 7th, which suited her exactly. So she said her prayers and soon fell fast asleep. When night fell, the masters of the little house came home. They were 7 dwarfs who worked with a pickaxe and spade, searching for copper and gold in the heart of the mountains. They lit their 7 candles and then saw that someone had been to visit them. The first said, "Who has been sitting on my chair?" The second said, "Who has been eating from my plate?" The third, "Who has taken my piece of bread?" The fourth, "Who has taken some of my vegetables?" The fifth, "Who has been using my fork?" The sixth, "Who has been cutting with my knife?" The seventh, "Who has been drinking out of my goblet?" The first looked round and saw that his bed was rumpled, so he said, "Who has been getting into my bed?" Then the others looked round, and each one cried, "Someone has been getting into my bed too." But the 7th, when he looked at his bed, saw little Snow White, who was lying there asleep. And he called the others, who came running up, and they cried out with astonishment, and brought their 7 little candles, and let the light fall on little Snow White. "Oh, heavens! Heavens!" cried they. "What a lovely child!" And they were so glad that they did not wake her up, but let her sleep on in the bed.
And the 7th dwarf slept with his companions, 1 hour with each, and so got through the night. When the sun rose, Snow White awoke, and oh, how frightened she was when she saw the 7 little dwarfs. But they were very friendly, and asked what her name was. "My name is Snow White," she answered. "And how did you come to get in our house?" asked the dwarfs. Then she told them how her cruel stepmother had intended her to be killed, but how the huntsman had spared her life, and she had run on until she reached the little house. And the dwarf said, "If you will take care of our house, cook for us, and make the beds, wash, mend, and knit, and keep everything neat and tidy and clean, then you may stay with us, and you shall lack for nothing." "Yes," answered Snow White, "with all my heart." And so she stayed. She kept the house neat and clean for the dwarfs, who went off early in the morning to search for copper and gold in the mountains, and who expected their meal to be standing ready for them when they returned at night. All day long Snow White was alone, and the good little dwarfs warned her to be careful to let no one into the house. "For," said they, "your stepmother will soon discover that you're living here." The Queen, believing, of course, that Snow White was dead, and that she had eaten her heart, and that therefore she was again the most beautiful lady in the land, went to her mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" Then the mirror answered, "O Lady Queen, though fair ye be, Snow White is fairer far to see. Over the hills and far away, she dwells with 7 dwarfs today." How angry she was, for she knew that the mirror spoke only the truth, and that the huntsman must have deceived her. She thought and thought how she might kill Snow White, for she knew she would have neither rest nor peace until she really was the most beautiful lady in the land. At length she decided what to do. She painted her face and dressed herself like an old peddler woman, so that no one could recognize her, and in this disguise she climbed the 7 mountains that lay between her and the dwarf's house, and she knocked at their door and cried, "Pretty things to sell, very cheap, very cheap." Snow White peeped from the window and said, "Good day, good wife, and what are your wares?" "All sorts of pretty things, my dear," answered the woman. "Silk and laces of every colour," and she held up a bright-coloured one made of pleated silks. "Surely I might let this honest old woman come in," thought Snow White, and unbolted the door and bought the pretty lace. "Dear, dear, what a sight for sore eyes you are, child," said the old woman. "Come, let me lace you properly for once." Snow White had no suspicious thoughts, so she placed herself in front of the old woman that she might fasten her dress with her new silk lace. But immediately the wicked creature laced her bodice so tightly that she could not breathe, and she fell down upon the ground as though she were dead. "Now," said the Queen, "I am once more the most beautiful lady in all the land."
When the dwarfs came home, they were very grieved to find their dear little Snow White lying upon the ground as though she were dead. They lifted her gently, and seeing that she was too tightly laced, they cut the silken cord, where she drew a long breath and then gradually came back to life. When the dwarfs heard all that had happened, they said, "The peddler woman was certainly the wicked queen. Now take care in future that you open the door to none when we are not with you." The wicked queen had no sooner reached home than she went to her mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" And the mirror answered as before, "O Lady Queen, though fair ye be, Snow White is fairer far to see. Over the hills and far away, she dwells with 7 dwarfs today." The blood rushed to her face as she heard these words, for she knew that Snow White must have come to life again. "But I will manage to put an end to her yet," she said. And then, by using her witchcraft, she made a poisonous comb. Again, she disguised herself, climbed the 7 mountains, and knocked at the door of the 7 dwarfs' cottage, crying, "Pretty little things to sell, very cheap today." Snow White looked out of the window and said, "Go away, good woman, for I dare not let you in." "Surely you can look at my goods," answered the woman, and held up the poisonous comb, which pleased Snow White so well that she opened the door and bought it. "Come, let me comb your hair in the newest way," said the woman, and the poor unsuspicious child let her have her way. But no sooner did the comb touch her hair than the poison began to work, and she fell fainting to the ground. "There, you model of beauty," said the wicked woman. "You are done for at last." But fortunately, it was almost time for the dwarfs to come home, and as soon as they came in and found Snow White lying upon the ground, they guessed that her wicked stepmother had been there again, and set to work to find out what was wrong. They soon saw the poisonous comb and drew it out of her hair, and almost immediately Snow White began to recover and told them what had happened. Once more they warned her to be on her guard and to open the door to no one. When the Queen reached home, she went straight to the mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" And the mirror answered, "O Lady Queen, though fair ye be, Snow White is fairer far to see. Over the hills and far away, she dwells with 7 dwarfs today." When the Queen heard these words, she shook with rage. "Snow White shall die," she cried, "even if it costs me my own life." She went into a secret chamber where no one else ever entered, and there she made a poisonous apple, and then she painted her face and disguised herself as a peasant woman, and climbed the 7 mountains and went to the dwarf's house. She knocked at the door. Snow White put her head out of the window and said, "I must not let anyone in. The 7 dwarfs have forbidden me to do so." "It's all the same to me," answered the peasant woman. "I shall soon get rid of these fine apples. But before I go, I'll make you a present of one." "Oh no," said Snow White, "for I must not take it." "Surely you are not afraid of poison?" said the woman. "See, I will cut one in two. The rosy cheek you shall take, and the white cheek I will eat myself." Now, the apple had been so cleverly made that only the rose cheek side contained the poison. Snow White longed for the delicious-looking fruit, and when she saw that the woman ate half of it, she thought there could be no danger, and stretched out her hand and took the other part. But no sooner had she tasted it than she fell down dead. The wicked queen laughed out loud with joy as she gazed at her. "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony. This time the dwarves cannot take you." And she went straight home and asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" And at length it answered, "Thou, O Queen, art fairest of all." So her envious heart had peace at last, as much as an envious heart can have peace. When the little dwarfs came home at night, they found Snow White lying upon the ground. No breath came from her parted lips, for she was dead. They lifted her tenderly and sought for some poisonous object which might have caused the mischief, and laced her frock, combed her hair, and washed her with wine and water, but all in vain. Dead she was, and dead she remained. They laid her upon a bier, and all 7 of them sat round it, and wept as though their hearts would break, for 3 whole days. When the time came that she should be laid in the ground, they could not bear to part from her. Her pretty little cheeks were still rosy red, and she looked just as though she was still living. "We cannot hide her away in the dark earth," said the dwarfs. And so they made her a transparent coffin of shining glass, and laid her in it, and wrote her name upon it in letters of gold, and that she was the king's daughter. Then they put the coffin out upon the mountain top, and one of them always stayed by it and watched it. And birds came too, and wept for Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, and last a dove. For a long, long time, little Snow White lay in the coffin, but she did not change. She only looked as though she slept, for her skin was still as white as snow, her lips as red as blood, and her hair as black as ebony. It chanced that a king's son came into the wood, and went to the dwarf's house, meaning to spend the night there. He saw the coffin upon the mountain top, with little Snow White lying within it, and he read the words that were written upon it in letters of gold. And he said to the dwarfs, "If you will but let me have the coffin, you may ask of me what you will, and I will give it to you." But the dwarfs answered, "We would not sell it for all the gold in the world."
Then said the prince, "Let me have it as a gift, I pray you, for I cannot live without seeing little Snow White, and I will prize your gift as the dearest of my possessions." The good little dwarfs pitied him when they heard these words, and so gave him the coffin. The king's son then bade his servants place it upon their shoulders and carry it away. But as they went, they stumbled over the stump of a tree, and the violent shaking shook the piece of poisonous apple which had lodged in Snow White's throat out again, so that she opened her eyes, raised the lid of the coffin, and sat up alive once more. "Where am I?" she cried. And the happy prince answered, "Thou art with me, dearest." Then he told her all that had happened, and how he loved her better than the whole world, and begged her to go with him to his father's palace and be his wife. Snow White agreed and went with him, and the wedding was celebrated with great splendour and magnificence. Little Snow White's wicked stepmother was invited to the feast, and when she had dressed herself in the most beautiful clothes, she stood before her mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest of all?" And the mirror answered, "O Lady Queen, though fair ye be, the young queen is fairer to see." Oh, how angry the wicked woman was then, and so terrified too, that she scarcely knew what to do. At first she thought she would not go to the wedding at all, but then she felt she could not rest until she had seen the young queen. No sooner did she enter the palace than she recognised little Snow White, and could not move for terror. But as punishment for the evil wicked stepmother's ways, a pair of red-hot iron shoes was brought into the room with tongs and set before her, and these she was forced to put on and to dance in them until she could dance no longer, but fell down dead. And that was the end of the wicked queen. And that was the story of Snow White by the Brothers Grimm. You'll find loads more stories on storynori.com. Until then, from me, Natasha, bye-bye.